Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Water Supply Infrastructure presentation by CPAT. My name is Zoe Arthurs, and I am the Heritage Management Archaeologist within the Historic Environment Advisory Service at CPAT. I welcome any questions you might have, but ask if you could kindly pop them in the chat. I'll address them at the end. We can also open the floor to some conversation, and for anyone interested in sight of the full report, please email me using the details on the final slide. The infrastructure of water supply is an impressive feat of engineering, one which has produced contested landscapes which figure prominently in narratives of Welsh nationalism. Although some of the more substantial structures and features were noted in the Historic Environment Record, or the HER, the archaeology of aspects of their construction was less well understood. In addition to the large reservoirs, there were a vast number of smaller ones, and the extent and fragility of this resource was unclear. There is a threat through climate change, not only from increased flooding events, but also from changes that may be made to mitigate the risk of those events. Some of these things can include weir modification and removal, and the removal or destruction of other in-river structures. Therefore, this project was conceptualised to preserve in digital form the legacy of water supply infrastructure and to make scheduling recommendations where possible to protect the more significant assets. This was predominantly a desk-based research project, but thanks to the GIS software and the enviable aerial photography coverage across Wales, we were able to deliver a comprehensive project using a variety of sources. Thanks to the CPAT library and a swathe of data available online, the first element of this project was a review of the secondary literature to identify sites of interest and any potential assets yet to be integrated with the HER. Once this was complete, an analysis of the existing data was undertaken. This data was collated in a gazetteer of existing records, and their established location aided in capturing additional features and areas of interest to the project. In a search and review of the HER, we identified new assets which were recorded and added to the data. A comprehensive report was then produced, which tied together the historiography and the new findings into one document, which was then submitted to Cadw, forming a unique and valuable archive of information related to water and industrial heritage in the area. The bringing together of all of the known archaeology with the additional new findings is essential in piecing together the fabric of Wales' past. Together with our ongoing projects, such as our Brecon Beacon National Park Tramways project, the interplay between themes and the bronchial nature of the transport, communications, industrial and social paths can begin to be understood. GIS software, aerial photography, LiDAR, digitised reports, secondary literature, Google Earth and Street View comprised an effective resource pool, but by far the most effective tool was the collective knowledge of experts within our team, some of whom had the ability to recall sites visited more than 30 years ago. Another less assuming but equally informative resource is the forums, blogs, memory pages and local societies with an online presence. These personal insights narrate something you can't read in a book, and the intangible folklore and memories associated with sites which have developed within a period of living memory is a priceless but not timeless archive. With the progression of the pandemic, the project design moved away from site visits and in-person community engagement to a working from home desk-based mode of study. This image shown here is a great example of the benefits of resources such as Google Street View, available to everybody. This previously unrecorded Victorian pump house was captured as part of the OS map review, so we knew that at one point or another a pump house was here. Aerial photography was annoyingly obscured by a shelter belt of trees, and the LiDAR coverage only confirmed the presence of a structure, but didn't report on its condition. Google Street View enabled us to see the quality and condition of the pump house, and although these images can be somewhat out of date, the likelihood that this building survives in good condition is quite high. At a time when movement was restricted due to the stay-at-home order, adapting the ways that we worked from home produced some really good outcomes and revealed plentiful sites to consider for future visits and investigation. This particular building, we have since discovered, has been adopted by a modern water company and continues in its life in water supply, albeit with some modern adaptations. Before we dive in and explore what we found, let's first establish a brief historiography of the events that led to these large and numerous schemes. As a revolution in urban governance swept Britain from the 1840s onwards, a revolution in water supply and drainage followed. The crowning glory of that movement was a water supply system called the gravitation scheme, shown at the top of this slide. This image was taken from the John Browick publication. It entailed the drastic reshaping of landscapes by damming rivers, raising lakes, or flooding valleys, and then piping water under pressure to distant cities. As the name implies, the gravitation scheme relied heavily upon gravity to do most of the moving. A series of valves and valve houses, pumps and filter beds helped in the balancing and movement, but on the whole, having a starting point which was higher than the end point was necessary for the scheme to work. This water system was a practical way of keeping rapidly expanding cities flush with clean water and washing away the human and industrial wastes, without which epidemics of typhus and cholera or miasmas would continue to ravage urban populations. The Industrial Revolution was well underway, and with exponential demand for both industry and rapidly growing populations, the developers were racing against the clock to find a suitable water supply. Given the requirement for a high starting point, good bedrock, and plenty of rainfall, companies looked to rural Wales for the answer. In this endeavour, many rural Welsh communities were displaced, their homes and villages submerged or demolished to make way for the water corporations, with little in the way of compensation, particularly for the tenants. And it wasn't just the risk of submersion. The compulsory purchase of land displaced many communities for the transport and housing infrastructure, as well as the curated woodland that we see and love today. We need to discuss the social impact these schemes had on populations, and while you can't deny the benefit to millions of people through the provision of clean water, we can't ignore the experience of rural Welsh communities. Reservoir and dam construction were the most impactful on local communities, both within the tangible landscape and in terms of social impact. The livable scheme at Burnley displaced 433 residents living in 37 houses and 10 farms. And the Birmingham scheme at Elland displaced 400 residents and submerged over 18 farmsteads. Only the landowners were compensated for the loss of homes and income, and the tenants were left with little choice but the workhouse. The reservoir at Talybont is relatively more recent, initially completed in 1926 to serve Newport before a revision in 1931 due to ill-considered seasonal water fluctuations. But even throughout the 20th century, schemes such as this continued to displace rural communities, with 17 dwellings submerged or destroyed as part of the water supply scheme there. A further scheme for 2 reservoirs was proposed by the Birkenhead Corporation for the Ceirog Valley in 1923, but with tensions rising, strong opposition from local authorities and landowners, it resulted in the cancellation of this scheme. Whether the water scheme supplied English cities, such as at Vyrnwy or Elam, or Welsh cities such as at Talybont, the communities being displaced were predominantly rural Welsh-speaking people, and so the submersion and destruction of homes not only destroyed their physical property, but it also threatened Welsh language, culture and heritage, causing tensions on both sides of the border. It's easy to forget when considering the impact of these schemes the sheer size of the areas bought up by the water corporations. This image is of Llyn Clwyd-Powys, and it does a good job of demonstrating the scale of one of these schemes. But it's not just the water storage, it's the entire landscapes that were purchased, and in addition to the reservoirs and dams, woodlands were created, with sloping lawns, fences, new boundaries, roads and tracks, which were established to serve both the domestic and commercial purposes. Model villages and transient camps were constructed to house the workforce, and so the horizon would be forever changed in the ideals of the water corporations. A collection of over 70 boundary markers on the Elan estate, captured as part of the data collection element of this project, indicate that compulsory purchase of land and assets outside of the ones submerged by reservoirs would have been on a massive scale. A recent project which I mentioned earlier, the CPAT Tramways project, has really highlighted the potential for the impact of these schemes to extend well beyond the boundary markers. The infrastructure required to provision dams in particular saw the desolation of local quarries and the creation of many more. In order to get the raw materials for construction to their correct location, an intricate network of tramways was established with the necessary infrastructure to support them, such as banks, drainage and the materials for building. This network has resulted in extensive linear scarification of the landscape, and the LiDAR results from these heavily worked areas narrate just how impactful these schemes were, changing the way locals lived and perceived their hometowns forever. When considering the tangible archaeology and what that tells us, it's equally important to remember the lived experience of those impacted by the water supply schemes. This image shows part of gardens at Nantgwilt House, now submerged at Cabancoch Reservoir, Elan Valley. This image was taken in 2003 during a period of low water level. Design woodland can be seen on the far shore, an example of the highly curated landscape as part of these schemes. The Elham Valley Trust, established in 1989, undertook a project entitled Memories of the Lost Valleys. As part of that project, they collated recollections from a former resident who lived directly opposite this site at her father's farm. At Christmas, she recalls enjoying treats in the drawing room at the Grand Mansion, Nantgwilt. She remembered the schoolhouse, attended by children from the surrounding valleys, and the tiny church where the community gathered each Sunday, its parson riding in from Rhayader on horseback every weekend. The Baptist chapel, accessible only via stepping stones, would baptise converts in the river there, and they would lead singing sessions for families and young folk. She also recalls the local shop, selling groceries and flour from the mill located next to the church. The archive closes with, "Oh, the memories of it all. It is too sad to think about." A powerful and emotive quote which captures the impact felt by communities far better than any report can. When we look at ruins like these ones at Nantgwilt, we must remember the context and understand that for some people this was home. As archaeologists, we build a picture not only of the physical structures, but of people and their way of life, and this must be as much part of our work as digging and writing. And it's not just modern communities which have been impacted by these schemes. The National Park offers us an excellent insight into the archaeological potential of sites submerged as part of water supply. On the left is an image from the HER, when both the upper and lower Neath reservoirs were filled, the dam sitting commanding between the two. On the right, a more recent image from Google Earth showing the reservoirs in their current state. The reservoirs were originally constructed in 1902 to provide Cardiff with clean drinking water after 2 devastating outbreaks of cholera. Since that time, CPAT have surveyed the area on numerous occasions, in 1976, 81, 89, 2005 and more recently in 2009. On each occasion, the varying water levels gave us an idea of the potential for further archaeology at this site, but with much of it at the water's edge in poor condition due to water damage. In 2015, a survey was commissioned by the water company to enable remedial works for the dam. Both reservoirs were drained, and they remain so, and this has given us a unique opportunity. The waterbed revealed an overwhelming amount of evidence of occupation and habitation from the late Mesolithic era, so around 6000 to 4000 BC. A dense array of cairns, hut circles, platforms, and a multitude of finds, such as flint scrapers and blades, and later barbed arrowheads, narrate sustained, ongoing occupation at the site. And that's not to mention the conjectural route of the Roman road which marches straight down the centre of the valley. This area has been in use long before the water companies made their plans. This rare opportunity has demonstrated the rich heritage of the area and the archaeological potential for other similar sites. Part of the water supply project was to record not only the modern modifications to the land, but the impact on the cultural heritage, and this single site shows that in its fullest sense. Many of the features that were identified were assessed to be so badly damaged by erosion that accurate dating is unlikely, even with extensive excavation. Nevertheless, the features identified here have been recorded as part of the project as evidence of cultural impact. You can find out more about the reservoirs on Archaeology, the HER for Wales. Now let's move on to summarise some of the tangible features we found as part of this project. 1,248 sites have been associated with the project in total. 145 new, previously unrecorded features have been identified, that is to say earmarked as historic environment features, providing a baseline for designation enhancement, development control and other threat-related management. Many of these features relate to the storage and transportation of water across both Wales and England. Other ancillary features include boundary markers on estates purchased by water corporations, quarries and mines which were worked for materials used in the construction of dams and buildings serving worker communities, mills and mill leats and other industrial archaeology necessary for provisioning large scheme workforce, historic trackways and roads, tramways and railways, some of which were purpose-built for transporting construction materials at many reservoirs, commemorative plaques dedicated to workers and the lost villages, platforms and clearings in the curated woodland narrating workers' camps' temporary accommodation, a plethora of structures and finds including Bronze Age earthworks and find spots submerged in reservoirs which reveal themselves in times of low water levels, as we've just discovered. And here is another structure that we found as part of this project. Built in 1931, the Legacy Tower at Wrexham was previously unrecorded in the HER. 1931 may not seem so long ago, but this grand building will soon be 100 years old. It's architecturally impressive, with Doric pilasters set on stone plinths, moulded stone architriving, double oak panelled doors, and a commemorative plaque recording a visit from the directors. This was constructed as a statement piece and was important to those in the area. The town has extensive water-based heritage. Early corn milling and then Victorian mill ponds with stunning red brick boundary walls predate this interesting structure. Its ongoing usage and sturdy construction means it's in great condition. What's really exciting to me, though, is that a mill race predates the route of the modern roadway, and that water was used to power the corn mill. It was later used to supply the mill pond, and it's now part of the infrastructure for a hydroelectricity plant. The whole town has quite literally been energised by water for hundreds of years, and the maps and architecture which are evidence of this still remain intact. Now that we've identified and recorded it, the site is now better protected from developments and will be eligible to be put forward for listed status, so wish us luck with this one. Some further examples of features we captured during this project. This image depicts a two-stone revetted former railway near the northern end of Cadw Reservoir, AIAYMB Valley. The upper railway, now a cycle path, led to Craigoch Dam, and the lower, now a footpath, to Pennygarreg Dam. The modern road can be seen to the left. This is a great example of hidden histories and the way in which people unknowingly consume heritage and areas of natural beauty such as this one. Historic routes like this can be used as an opportunity to engage people with what came before. So if you're walking or cycling here, share this information with people around you and stimulate thought and conversation about water supply in Wales. This is a previously unrecorded boathouse at Brecons Reservoir, captured on a 2nd edition OS map. The brickwork looks to be in reasonable condition, and now that it's part of the water supply project, it can be surveyed and managed in the proper way. Buildings like this are a great example of how locals, walkers and explorers can help preserve the historic environment and the structures therein. Assets such as this can be submitted to the relevant Welsh Archaeological Trust for integration with the HER, and we should encourage more people to come forward if earthworks or standing structures are discovered. Much of the infrastructure is still in use today, adopted and adapted by modern water companies for the provision of water across Wales and England. As we saw in one of the earlier slides, pump houses and workshops continue in use today, which is fantastic for the ongoing care of the buildings. It's not only the obvious which survive though. We know the reservoirs and dams survive because we can see them, huge and dominating in the landscape. Lesser known though are the tracks and roads which were established as part of the water supply scheme. The winding roads in AIAYMB Valley revolved from the transport routes used during construction. Many of the tram and railways exist either as modern railway routes or as trackways frequented by walkers. It's quite the legacy. Now that this project has been undertaken, we have a valuable archive of information from which to launch further investigation. As restrictions are lifted and movement becomes less restricted, site visits and community projects have begun again. I'm sure you've all been following our recent excavations. We hope to be able to continue with projects like these and to find out more about how communities feel today about the issues we have raised and what needs to be done to secure a future for the heritage and culture of Wales. In conclusion, this project is far bigger and more complex than first meets the eye. The impact of the water supply companies, the scale on which these schemes were carried out, and the sheer number of schemes is hard to comprehend, affecting the most rural towns and villages to the biggest cities. The infrastructure required to deliver these schemes, though, is astonishing, from the tiniest of valves, and there were hundreds of them, to the reservoirs capable of storing tens of thousands of litres of water, the sprawling transport infrastructure and the raw materials they carried for construction, the workers' homes, and the villages lost and built. Even the landscapes, which many feel to be natural, are highly curated, man-made ideals. It shouldn't stop us from enjoying these incredible feats of engineering, but we should pause to consider how natural is the environment we inhabit. A question for future archaeologists too. An interesting comparison that's recently come to light is the planned woodland planting in Wales. Once again, rural Welsh communities are at risk of sweeping changes to the landscape at huge economic benefit to those outside of Wales. The Welsh Government last year launched a plan to create a national forest, promising to increase the number of trees being planted every year to improve air quality and reduce greenhouse gases. The policy aimed to create woodlands that are accessible to people and give local communities the opportunity to get involved and help to promote Welsh language, culture and heritage. But there have been calls recently to make urgent changes to that strategy, which currently allows companies outside of Wales to take advantage of generous forestry grants. Large-scale multinational investment companies have been buying up farms across the country for afforestation, something which locals claim is destroying communities. These farms often sell far beyond their guide price, making purchase within the community impossible. As with historic water supply, the need for climate change mitigation is absolutely necessary, but the way multinational corporations go about achieving those outcomes needs to be sensitively considered and carefully regulated for the benefit of all people. I hope that final slide has provided everyone with some food for thought to leave this presentation with, and I do hope you've enjoyed listening to our presentation on water supply today. If you have any questions, we'll answer them shortly, or if you prefer, you can contact me using the information shown here. I'll now hand over to Jack, who's going to host our question time. Thanks, Jack.